to part 2 of our lecture for this module 1 of international relations, and what we're looking at is the next slide in the lecture here, where we talk just a little bit about the timeless wisdom of realism. If you remember from our first lecture, we said that one of the things that's really sort of central in myth making in political life anyway is this idea that things can be truer, or the truth of certain stories can be more powerful if they can draw on age-old truths that have been sort of held to be true for millennia. And of course, in international relations, we're no exception. So we think about what we've just been talking about, the 3 S's: statism, survivalism, self-help. The state being the primary object of international politics. Why? Because it has sovereignty. What does it want to do as an actor? It wants to survive. It wants to achieve its greater goals, and the greater goals of being precisely this notion of the good life, are the idea that there's an aspiration that the entire population is trying to ascribe to, and even dictators, we've suggested, have to be cognizant of that to a certain extent, because they too, A, have an idea of the good life that they're working towards, and B, they can't just do anything they want with their population. They have to somehow respect the basic mores that the populations have. Otherwise they will lose power, because, as Machiavelli classically reminds us, there's limitations to what even dictators can do. So, I realize my microphone is a little bit far away there. So we have to contend with this aspect of international politics, the statism through sovereignty, the survivalism of the state. It has to put its military goals first if it's going to be able to survive long enough to achieve its greater moral purpose, if you want to put it in those terms. And then thirdly, we talked about self-help as being the difficulty that nation states confront when they're trying to survive in conditions of anarchy, because no one's out there to help you. There's no court that you can appeal your disputes to. There's no international government or international police force that you can go to. You can't just call the cops if you're in trouble. So you have to help yourself. And in order to help yourself, then we enter into what's sometimes known as the zero-sum game. In international relations, realists really put this as a central point. The zero-sum game is this idea that there's only so much security to go around, and if you have one more tank than me, that's one less tank that I have, and I have to enter into some kind of situation to either balance you out by building another tank myself, or entering into a relationship with another power who's equally threatened by you and your tank, and together we have to combine our powers to balance you out. So that's the basic rudiment of realism in a nutshell, I would argue. But as a philosophy, or as a theory of international relations, we should understand that this is an approach to international politics that really does transcend academic history. It's only recently that universities have been teaching what we call today international relations, but realism as an approach to thinking about international relations, or the relations between states, goes back thousands of years. And in fact, in the image here we see a bust of Thucydides, the great historian, the great Greek historian, who wrote of the Peloponnesian Wars and the rise of the Athenian Empire after the defeat of the Persians, and the fact that many of the other powers in the Greek archipelago felt very threatened by Athens' rise to power, because Athens was a democracy and it seemed to be very hell-bent on including as many other states in its democratic regime as possible, when many of these other states didn't really fancy themselves as living that way. They thought democracies were kind of craven creatures. So at the sort of climax of this story, we see the Spartan alliance coming to meet the Athenian forces, and one of the hapless victims in the middle of this conflict is the island of Melos, the Melian islanders who the Athenians approach. The Athenians get there first and present the Melians with basically what's the term I'm looking for? An ultimatum is the term I'm looking for. They present the Melians with an ultimatum, and they say, you guys have to join with us because we can't afford the risk of you joining with them. And the Melians say, no, we're not going to join with anyone. We're firmly neutral in this conflict. And the Athenians say, well, you say that, but we're nice people. Those Spartans are much more cruel than we, and they could threaten you with death if you didn't join them. So you'd sort of have to join them. So the rule of international relations and the survival of the fittest in anarchy demands that we have to make the same kind of ultimatum to you that the Spartans would make, not because we're bad people, but because we have to. And this is Thucydides' observation, is that the structure of international relations forces even the better people to sometimes descend to tyrannical ultimatums to independent powers, neutral powers, when the stakes are very high. And so we see in this quote, the famous quote from Thucydides, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And that's because of anarchy, right? It's not personal. The Athenians had no personal issues with the Melians, but they had to offer them this ultimatum, because at the end of the day, if they didn't, it led to the possibility that the Spartans would be even stronger than the Athenians, and the Athenians had to do it. So, as it happens, by the way, if you want to know what happens at the end of the story, the Melians refuse to accede to the Athenian demands, and in the morning, then the Athenians send in the army and kill all the men of military service age, and install a garrison of 500 soldiers in order to occupy the island. And so from Thucydides then we get this very sort of cynical view of how the world is. And even though human beings might get more philosophical, or have iPads and better technologies and all these sorts of things, it doesn't change the basic never-ending tragedy, this ever-repeating wheel of history, that the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. This law of power is something that nobody can ever change, because we can never have a world government, we can never have a world police force. We're stuck with this anarchy, and because of that, then the human condition is kind of tragic. A similar argument comes to us from Machiavelli, who talked about human nature and how human beings tend to be duplicitous in international relations as well. So Machiavelli informs a kind of a realism. He, like Thucydides, believed, and I think most people believe Machiavelli is a modern thinker. And what does that mean? If we say someone is a modern thinker, it means that they don't study human beings through the lens of religious scripts. They don't study human beings through the lens of idealistic philosophies. They study human beings as they are. And this is the basic idea of a modern or scientific approach to human nature. So for Machiavelli then, like for Thucydides, we should be looking at human beings in terms of what they do, not what they say. And we shouldn't go around with convoluted notions of how it is that men ought to be. We shouldn't try to reform people. What we should be focusing on is making the world peaceful as it is, figuring out what it's going to take to bring peace between men, knowing that men are fairly cruel in terms of their human nature. So Machiavelli then says that the one thing we know about human beings, and that we can say with scientific certainty, is that human beings kind of suck, that they are, as he says here in the quote, ungrateful, fickle, deceptive, deceiving, avoiders of danger, and eager to gain. So the question Machiavelli puts to us then really is, assuming this notion or this definition of human nature is true, how would you advise the prince? How would you advise the president? Well, clearly, if you knew that the international sphere was anarchic, and you knew there was no way to guarantee your peace because there's no international law and no international police force, then you know that people are not going to be very trustworthy unless, of course, their interests are on the line. Their fear might be in play, right? So that you know you can trust someone when this is this sort of basis of this old phrase, for example, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And you know that when someone's fear is in play, that you can trust that person at the very least to want to defend themselves, to want to preserve their life. And so Machiavelli tells us that you can imagine certain types of cooperation emerging in international relations, but they're only going to be short-lived forms of cooperation. And that's an important point. It means that human beings are willing to sort of operate together when their lives are at stake, but probably not for much more than that. So what this does is it leads us to the statesman's perspective, this is what we call raison d'etat. Machiavelli's argument, Thucydides' argument, is sort of developing. They are developing a sort of a philosophy of statesmanship based on this idea of the inherent dangerousness of the world in which they're operating. Machiavelli was considered a bit of a rebel in his time because a lot of the people who were advising statesmen, a lot of the statesmen who were advising kings and queens at Machiavelli's time were of a mind that the goal was to pursue God's will. The goal was to create God's kingdom on earth. But Machiavelli says that this is incredibly idealistic and that it exposes you to danger. He, for example, notes that Christianity tends to teach the value of turning the other cheek, and he's very cynical about the usefulness of that value in a world of anarchy, right? Why would you want to turn the other cheek? So from Machiavelli's perspective, this is the kernel of the reason the Roman Empire fell. The Roman Empire had been the mightiest ever known, and yet it fell. And it fell not long after its conversion to Christianity. So Machiavelli is opposed to Christianity as a guiding ethos for navigating the treacherous waters of international politics. Within the nation state, of course, he says you can be what you want because you have sovereignty there to protect you, and you live in a much more certain world. So religion is fine within a nation state, but religion as a guiding philosophy for advising us in our relations with other nation states in the realm of anarchy, so we're separating the domestic from the international here, and that's very important. This is a basic idea. You need to, by all means, nurture your sense of sentimentality and your ideals within your domestic life, within the nation state. But when it comes to the international realm, because of its anarchy, that's not a good thing to do. So Machiavelli advises us that the most important thing as a prince or as a president or a foreign policy maker, the most important thing is to be cunning and have strength, like the fox and the lion. Let the fox and the lion be your guiding metaphors. The fox is notoriously clever and cunning, and the lion has strength. And those are the two things that will get you through, that will help you survive in a dog-eat-dog world. And the other thing Machiavelli has to say is that when you want to be idealistic, don't pursue your ideals at the expense of your strength, because, as he says, it is better to be feared than loved, right? You'd love for everyone to love you, and indeed that would be very, very nice. But if you have to choose between fear and love, it's better to be feared. And many people would agree with that to this day. But in the inset here, we see this term raison d'etat. And having talked about Machiavelli now, and Machiavelli I would suggest is one of the sort of founding fathers of raison d'etat, but the historian Meinecke speaks of Machiavelli as a sort of a seminal figure here in establishing raison d'etat, and suggests that raison d'etat is the first law of motion, the first, if you will, scientifically certain principle that we can take to the bank, as it were, in terms of how nation states think and why they do what they do. Raison d'etat describes not how states would like to be, but how they must be in order to survive in anarchy. So raison d'etat is the French term for reason of state, and basically it's the term that we use even to this day to describe the kind of user's manual of the statesman in an anarchic world. And there's two basic principles, of course, and you can see Machiavelli's voice in these principles. One, in an uncertain world, in a dog-eat-dog world of anarchy, always seek to maximize the power of your state, because you never know when the bad times are coming, and it's better to have that power for when the bad times come. And then the second point is, never sacrifice your power for your ideals. That will make you weak in a literal or material sense, but it will also make you weak in a perception sense, that the people around you will perceive you as weak, and you don't want that. So that's very important. So now we're moving from the historical versions of realism with Thucydides and Machiavelli into the contemporary context. Now, there's something we have to be very careful about here. Realism sort of splits in two, and one of the things we're going to be talking about today is neorealism, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. But just for now, when we talk, as Machiavelli talks about separating morality from our sense of sentimentality, from our idealism, from our ethical disposition, domestically speaking, Machiavelli and none of the other realists really are super keen to have us think that what they're preaching is amorality, right? It's not that they are saying that one should have no morals whatsoever. And so we got to be careful and think through what that means to say that they don't have to have any morals whatsoever. Thucydides, and you can see this in one of the supplemental readings I've put up for you for this module by Ned Lebo. If you read his essay, you'll see very clearly that Ned Lebo describes Thucydides of warning of the dangers of hubris. And what is hubris? Hubris is a Greek word that effectively means arrogance, although that's the way we use it today. But from Lebo's perspective, he goes for the more classical Greek definition of the word hubris. And hubris there is not just arrogance, it's a specific type of arrogance. It's acting solely towards your own ends, regardless of the values of the community around you. So, realism for the classical Greeks, for the ancient Greeks, for Machiavelli, was very aware of the norms and values of the people that were around you. And it was aware that even if you were going to pursue power and be a realist, you couldn't just pursue power without any regard for the consequences of how you would be perceived by those around you. And so this raises a very important question when we think about realism. Is realism hell-bent on world domination? No. Because realism understands the limits of power, and it also understands the limits of people's patience with us, right? That if we started dominating and pushing people around all the time, that maybe they would gang up on us in exchange, right? So this idea of hubris, this idea of needing to respect the attitudes and the values of the people in the community of nations around you is a part of the older version of realism that maybe newer versions of realism, we're going to talk about neorealism in a little minute, but certainly the older versions of realism definitely maintained that stance. And so the question would be, is realism intrinsically warlike? Not really. So that maybe explains why a lot of realists came out against the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq, because they suggested that in fact that was precisely a case of hubris, right? Precisely a case of the Bush administration sort of ignoring the dominant attitudes and values of many of the other powerful nation states that had a stake in what was going on in Iraq. So, for example, in distinction to George Bush Sr., when he went into Kuwait, he had a huge coalition of nations, including France and many, many other countries that were all lined up ready to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. This time around, Bush Jr. Went in without all that support, right? He did not have the coalition of nations behind him fully. He had a small selection of nations that were going to help out, like Britain, but really not a lot of, certainly nothing like the vast international coalition that was put together for the first Gulf War. So this means we need to think about realism for a second as not so much a science, even though it tries to preach science, our scientific ethos and perspective on the basis of its reading of human nature, but it also understands that human beings are not robots, that there is this human factor, that fear, that psychology, pride, all of these things play a role. So it's important to keep that in mind, I think, as we compare this classical version of realism to the more contemporary versions of realism that I'm going to be describing now in a minute. Classical realism, if I were to put it in a nutshell, believes in the human factor, right? It believes in, it has an appreciation for the unpredictability, for the qualitative nature of psychology, suggesting that we can be irrational, human beings can make mistakes, we can be prideful, all of these things, right? So just keep that in mind as we move forward in this lecture, okay? Now we're going to talk about the difference between realism and more contemporary versions of realism. The classical realism of the Greeks, the classical realism that still many people like Henry Kissinger and Hans Morgenthau would have been arguing in favor of, even in more recent times, versus what we call academic or system realism, or neorealism, which comes in a much more contemporary world. So in the image here, by the way, we have what's known as the stag hunt. This is a classic stag hunt image, and you can see everyone off there chasing this deer across the landscape. Keep that image in mind for just a second, because we're going to be talking about it in a minute. So how do we understand this difficult proposition that there are two different strands of realism? And I've described them here on this slide, the two different strands of realism. One is classical and the other is neorealism. And we have a quote here from Hans Morgenthau, who was a classical realist alive in the last century, someone who commented a lot on the Vietnam War and who was actually a teacher for Henry Kissinger, who is still alive today. Classical realism poses this definition here from Morgenthau, rather, poses this definition: politics is governed by laws that are created by human nature. The mechanism we use to understand international politics is through the concept of interests defined in terms of power. So what's Morgenthau saying there? Remember, we talked about the human factor. So what we're doing here is we're starting, much as Machiavelli started, much as Thucydides started, we're starting with the idea of a human being at the center of our analysis. Human beings being fallible, sometimes having clear understandings of what their interests are, but sometimes those interests being clouded over by vanity, by lust for power. These various human psychological factors come into play. So man lusts for power. This sort of idea is at the center of classical realism, and so from a realist perspective, then realism is a tragic theory. Do you know what I mean? It's clear that no realist would like the world to be this way, but because human nature kind of sucks, and we're cheaters and stealers and ever searching for power, and forever making mistakes and forever being vain, that this is where wars come from. Okay. Now, more contemporary versions of realism, like neorealism, have a little bit of a dim view on this very, very negative view of human nature. And I'm just going to give you a little footnote here, because I think this is important. This is just something I suspect about contemporary realism. Contemporary realism, or neorealism, comes out of the Cold War, right? It's something that was created in American universities after World War II, with a view to trying to create a new framework of thinking about international relations that suited the belief structure that many people had at that time, which was emerging in the context of the Cold War, right? Where it was seen that the Soviet Union was a kind of evil regime that was hell-bent on world domination. And American foreign policy analysts at the time didn't really want to be thinking about the problem of global relations or international relations as being rooted in this notion of human nature, where we're all equally horrible because what they were seeing was a world where, no, actually, we're not all equally horrible. America is a democracy. We have good people, and those people over there, they're the Soviet Union. They actually are the ones that we have the real trouble with. They're the ones we should be careful about. So it was this idea that maybe realism was wrong to sort of impute this negative characteristic to all human beings, to say that human nature was fallible for everyone. Surely surely for the neorealists there was such thing as a good person. So they set out to have a more scientific approach to international politics, which took the human factor out, because at the end of the day you can't really measure it, and you can't really base a foreign policy on this idea. They argued that there's only ever bad people. So this more scientific, modern stance on it was going to look at the other factors that could potentially lead nation states to war. And what they came up with was what they call a systematic theory that wasn't so much focused on the human factor as the context within which nation states were acting, and they called that context anarchy. And so famously we have the quote from Waltz, and this is the quote that we're focusing on for our module this week: "International anarchy is the permissive cause of war." International anarchy is the permissive cause of war. It means that while there might be other immediate causes of war, even if those immediate causes were present, without the permissive cause, no wars could ever take place. So the thing that allows wars to happen, regardless of the human factor, is anarchy. And it's the anarchic thing that we need to be focusing on if we want to understand why wars happen. Because after all, human nature is not a sufficient enough cause, right? We need to think about the anarchic dimension. And when you're thinking about anarchy, what you're looking at is the fact that nation states, perhaps even good nation states, right? This is very important, so hang on to my words here. We're backing away from the human nature explanation of war. We're looking at the system level explanation of war. So here we have the possibility of thinking about good nation states, or inherently well-minded or good-minded nation states, potentially having to engage in preparations for war, and even in warlike activity, not because they want to, but because simply security is a prerequisite for their survival in this anarchic context. So let's break that point down a little bit further and try to develop our analysis of what we're calling neorealism. Here in this slide we see an image of several billiard balls, and the billiard ball metaphor is very, very important for neorealism. And I just want you to look at that image for a second and think about why we would want to look at nation states as billiard balls, as opposed to the thinking about or reflecting on the individual human beings that comprise the government and the foreign policy ministries or what have you within that nation state. Why are we anxious here to distance ourselves from human beings and thinking about why wars happen? Why would this metaphor of the billiard ball be useful? As we were saying, unlike realists, neorealists tend to distance themselves from the human nature aspect of previous theories put forward, like Thucydides or Machiavelli or Morgenthau. They're arguing that it's not necessary to look at the mindset of the actual policymakers within the nations. Why? Because, well, basically nation states are functionally equivalent to each other. They all have the same basic functions. They are all states, they all want to survive, and they're all going to have to engage in self-help in the context of anarchy. So the focus as a result of this, of course, as we said in our slide a little while back, was the zero-sum game component. If we're looking at nation states as being bound into this self-help mentality, where they're preoccupied with the relative amount of power in the system, do I have as many tanks as you? No. Therefore, I either have to build more tanks or ally myself with someone else who's equally threatened by your tanks, another little power. So the security dilemma is this zero-sum game. If one state gains in security, the other necessarily loses, and this leads to a relativism in our appraisal of the distribution of power. And as we've said before, it can lead to an arms race. But paradoxically, it can lead to what we call balance of power, right? It can lead to peace in a way. It's a kind of an odd piece, or it's a kind of a piece that you'd be sort of almost ashamed to call peaceful. But from a neorealist perspective, it's a very real and palpable piece, and it's one that we ought to take very seriously. So that's the billiard ball model, which is the guiding metaphor for what we're talking about here. Now, on this image here, we have Kenneth Waltz's levels of analysis. And this is important for our lecture today because it's important in terms of setting up our study of the film that we're going to be looking at this module, which is Lord of the Flies, and we're basing that, of course, on our reading of Cynthia Weber in her textbook. Now, what does it mean to have levels of analysis, right? Well, levels of analysis, each level of analysis refers to a way in which we can sort of focus our study of the causes of war. Do we want to focus on human nature? We've talked a little bit about human nature as the classical realist explanation. We haven't talked so much about states and the character of states and societies. We'll get to that in a minute. That's more of a liberal preoccupation. And then the third image is the international system of anarchy, or the system of international anarchy. And what we're trying to explain here is the difference between immediate causes and permissive causes, and why Waltz was so hung up on the idea of a need to focus on the third image, the system, or the anarchic level. So let's think about this for a second. We already know that our classical realists, Machiavelli, Thucydides, Morgenthau, were really sort of suggesting that it was the fallibility of man, it was the flaw in human character that was driving the tendency of nation states to fall ever into this repeating cycle of war. Waltz doesn't disagree with that. He believes that that's relevant, but that's an immediate cause, because think about it for a second, and we'll get into this in a bit more detail in a minute, but if you didn't have anarchy there, you know, you and I are human beings operating in a nation-state context where we have a police force. Our human nature may well suck, but because we're afraid of the police force, we keep our habits and desire to steal things and have other people's things in check. We discipline ourselves. We engage in self-disciplinary behavior. So Waltz says, okay, you know, human nature may suck, and it's an immediate cause of war, but where people are obliged by the structure of their situation to keep their human nature in check, then clearly there are circumstances where human nature is not a sufficient variable in explaining why wars happen. So the second image then, we haven't talked so much about it in this lecture. We will in the next module, because we'll be talking about liberalism. But just as a sort of a sneaky preview, liberals tend to look at the character of states and societies, and they tend to say, well, you know, there's clearly a difference between democracies and non-democratic states. So the liberals tend to believe that democratic states don't go to war with each other, and they have a lot of empirical evidence to back that up. But, says Waltz, again, that's an immediate factor, or an immediate type of cause. It's not necessarily fair to suggest that that is a cause which is exclusive or sufficient all in of itself, because sometimes democracies arguably do go to war with each other, and we can imagine all manner of situations where democracies might be inclined to go to war with each other, even though it's hard to conceive. So, says Waltz, sure, it could be an immediate cause of war if there was an anti-democratic or non-democratic country challenging a democratic country, or even maybe two democratic countries going to war with each other. But nevertheless, we know that where there would be laws and principles in place to keep those sorts of behavior, that would not be allowed to happen. So Waltz reaches then for the third image. Having talked about man, having talked about the level of society, he now wants to talk about the third image, which is the system of international anarchy. And here he's saying, now here is what we call the permissive cause, right? Without this cause, wars literally could not happen. So there's nothing we can do about the other causes in a way, right? The wars seem to happen regardless of how we address human nature or how we address states and societies level. But at this level, it does make a difference. We can do something about international anarchy. At least we can attempt to mitigate it somehow. Or at least that's the question. And so Waltz is going to focus his analysis on this question of the third image. So earlier on we had our little picture of the stag hunt, and this is a myth that the neorealists use to explain why they put such a focus on the third image. This is a picture of Kenneth Waltz here in our slide. So we have two quotes from Waltz which are kind of useful for us in thinking about anarchy. First of all, he says that in anarchy there is no automatic harmony. A state will use force to attain its goals if after assessing the prospects for success, it values those goals more than it values the pleasures of peace. And so it's a pure cost-benefit analysis. A nation-state will resort to force if its goals look to be more important than the goal of peace. And so you can imagine all kinds of scenarios where a nation-state may want to engage in warlike behavior in order, for example, to preserve its peace, our prosperity, our standard of living. But it depends. Sometimes you have to spend a little to get a little, right? And so that's, I think, Waltz's argument here. But all of this is based in the metaphor of the stag hunt. So what is this stag hunt? The stag hunt is the idea that it's originally put forward by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's this idea that without government, human beings have a temptation to steal from each other whenever they try to cooperate. And that's a really big problem for us. So the stag hunt metaphor goes a little bit like this. You have a bunch of guys, they meet each other in the woods, and they are basically kind of cavemen, for want of a better term. Off they go to, having agreed to cooperate to bring down a stag, they go off on the hunt. But the problem is, as they're off hunting, no one knows for sure that when they bring the stag down, they're going to get their fair share. They're going to get their fair share of the stag. Perhaps the others will gang up on them, or perhaps one guy, he looks a little stronger than the other guys, and he'll steal a little bit of the share, right? So there's a trust, there's a risk inherent in the idea of trusting there, because there's no government to make sure in this stag hunt that everyone's going to get their equal share. So these cavemen have a kind of a security dilemma in their minds. Maybe you can see where this is going. But as the quote implies, as the stag hunt is ongoing, a hare, a rabbit, jumps across the pathway, and one of the cavemen spots the hare and goes, you know, I don't really like hare as much as I like stag meat, but on the other hand, that hare would definitely satisfy my hunger, and if I don't go and grab it, perhaps another guy in the group here will see that hare and he'll leave his post to chase for it, and that's going to compromise the integrity of the group, because it takes 5 men to bring down the stag, but they'd only have 4 men available to take down the stag, and so the stag would win. So the question is the question really of cooperation. What will keep a group together, loyal to each other, and cooperating with each other under conditions of anarchy, when it's so tempting to pursue the short-term goal at all times? And this is precisely Waltz's question. So where Machiavelli and the others are reading the tragedy as more to do with human nature, Waltz is reading the tragedy as to do with the structure within which human beings find themselves. And so in anarchy, this stag metaphor of Rousseau captures perfectly the problem, which today we sometimes call the prisoner's dilemma. It's just another way of saying the same thing. How easy is it for people to cooperate when there's a short-term alternative that people can go for, that they know that they can have for little or no cost, when the risks of maintaining maintaining your loyalty and to the group are so high and so risky. Did I just say the risks of maintaining loyalty with the group are high and risky? There you go. Gotta love it. I haven't had coffee today, so sorry about that. But this is the aforementioned prisoner's dilemma, and all this really is a way, guys. It may look a little complicated, but it's actually very, very simple. All we're trying to do is say what we've just said, that sometimes in an anarchic situation, it literally looks costly to maintain an investment in a group behavior when the risks are so high that the group may fall apart or that betrayal may happen in the group, and there's no way to find recourse to justice, to the courts of law, to see to it that you would be compensated for the contract being violated or for the promise being broken. And so we use the prisoner's dilemma as a metaphor here. And basically this is this situation where there's two captives. When faced with the option of cooperating or squealing on one another, they're always going to choose the latter. Why? Because literally it's the best option given the circumstances. It's the rational option given the circumstances. Okay, so what we have here is a situation where we give points. We map this out in this metric here by giving points to the different options that their prisoners have available to them. So they've just carried out a bank robbery. The cops have them in the detention center and they're interrogating them. And the prisoners know that if neither of them squeal, the cops really can't hang anything on them, right? So the cops have to find a way to game the prisoners, to play the prisoners, to get them to squeal on each other. And what they do is they change the stakes. They're not just interviewing them. Now what they've done is they've created a situation whereby if one guy squeals on you, then you're going to die. And that may seem very extreme, but it's a threat. And not only if he squeals on you will you die, but he's going to get a reward. Okay, so now I've got something to think about. My partner in crime is after all a criminal. So what do criminals do? Well, they love money. He may not want to kill me, but my gosh, he will love to have a bit of cash. So we have this incentive structure here, where on the one hand there's an incentive to get the extra money, and then there's an incentive, of course, to survive, and that's going to play on the mind of prisoner B, as prisoner A may also be being presented with the same option by the cops. So here's a funny thing that happens. Both the prisoners think about it for a minute, and they go, well, gosh, I think I know that guy pretty well, but, how well do I know him? Do I trust him? It's my life that's on the line here. That's the highest stakes game of any game that we can play. Do I really want to take the risk of not betraying my friend? I love the guy, but am I prepared to die for him? And especially when I know that he's being presented with the exact same choice that I am, and he's having to think the exact same thought that I am thinking right now. So the police step back and let the psychological ramifications of this play out. These guys are going to get themselves in trouble here by ratting each other out. And eventually, of course, as the prisoners have time to reflect on the dilemma that they're in, even though the optimal thing for them to do would be for neither one to squeal, because there's an advantage for one to be gained above and beyond the utility that he would gain by mere survival, because he would get a reward, there is a plausible incentive for prisoner B in prisoner A mind. In prisoner A's mind, there's a plausible incentive for prisoner B to betray him. And in the meantime, if that betrayal happens, of course, prisoner A has to contend with the fact that he's going to be facing his own certain death, which creates an incentive for him. So no matter which way you look at it, whether you're the guy who's interested in the money or the guy that just simply doesn't want to die, but of course the thing is that situation is exactly mirrored for each prisoner, and so each is going through the same calculus. I don't want to die, I'd like the money. One or other of those things will be preference, but you can't think of one without the other. Each is in play at the same time. So that channels the decision factor, even though maybe both of these guys are nice people. Hey, maybe they're not even criminals at all. Maybe they're the people that are wrongly detained. But they're still going to be stuck in this game. They're still going to be stuck in the prisoner's dilemma. And the structure of the dilemma, regardless of whether they are good or bad people, regardless of their human nature, is going to shove them into the bottom right quadrant, where you see the utility is the lowest in aggregate, right? So you can see in the top left quadrant the combined utilities for top right quadrant 0 and 3 is 3, bottom left quadrant 3 and 0 is still 3. So it's clearly the best case scenario in terms of utility for everyone is where there's 4, right? But because of the structure of the situation and because of the way the situation, the utility would be distributed, it creates an incentive for the prisoners to end up at an outcome that is suboptimal, but at least they both survive. And that, what I've just said there, if you haven't found this easy to understand, I apologize, but what I've just said there, that the suboptimal outcome being the preferred outcome, not because they want it, but because it's the only one where they can guarantee their survival. That is neorealism in a nutshell. And so it's a tragic situation, but it's the situation that the prisoners find themselves in regardless. So I want to look at this slide now as a way of just quickly sort of summarizing the difference between classical and neorealism. The unit of analysis for classical realism is human nature, or individuals within the state. The key focus, analytically speaking, is on the tragic, power-hungry, ever-avaricious nature of the human beings. The dilemma that human beings face in a world full of son-of-a-bitches, as you might say, is one of survival. That's fair enough. And, of course, we know that the principle of action there is going to be maximizing power in a condition of self-help. So, obviously, you sort of end up in a very similar position to neorealism, but the basis of the theory is different. As you see, for neorealism, it's not so much individuals within the state, but the state itself. We're not so much interested in human nature because it doesn't really explain that much to us. But where some people, the liberals, for example, as we'll look at in the next module, think about the state as being different depending on whether it's a democratic or a dictatorial state, Waltz doesn't care. Because why? Because even good states still face the problem of the uneven distribution of power under conditions of anarchy. And it's the uncertainty, the shadow of the future, if you will. If we go back to the prisoner's dilemma, it's the uncertainty of knowing what your partner's going to do that creates this tendency for you to have to spend money on the military. Let's face it, no country wants to spend money in the military. It's kind of a waste of money, really, because they don't produce anything of value except security. They don't produce things that sell on the market. They don't produce revenue. They are a net sucking sucker, if you will, or a vampire on taxes. And that's not to insult the military. It's just to say that's the nature of things, right? I'm far from it, want to insult the military. I'm just simply saying that that you know, while all they do is absorb tax powers and defend us, right? Of course, sometimes they're going to lay down their lives, and that's huge. But in terms of what a nation state would prefer, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have a military at all, right? We'd put our tax dollars towards building hospitals and building schools and things like that, right? So even good countries get the blues, would be the point. And here we have this point that nation states, even good ones, even democratic ones, will face the problem of the uneven distribution of power and anarchy. And of course, because of that, then they too must survive and practice self-help. But the principle of action isn't so much embracing power and eschewing real idealism. Rather, it is maximizing security. It is just simply being prepared for the worst at all times. It looks very similar to embracing power, but one gets the impression reading Machiavelli and others that they're kind of like embracing power almost like joyfully, whereas neorealism suggests embracing power almost hesitantly and with a heavy heart, so to speak. So I hope that's helpful. Now, I'm going to stop the lecture here, and we will have a little bit of sort of slide work when we've watched the movie. But here are some questions which I'd like you to think about for your journal when you've watched the movie. First of all, is this film a good case study of neorealism? Is it indeed a prisoner's dilemma scenario? And if not, why? So the key question here, and I'm getting this from Cynthia Weber, and I think her chapter is really excellent. It bears some reading, it bears some scrutiny, but if you focus in on what she's saying, at the end of the day, what she's trying to ask is, I think, whether there's an argument to be made here at all that the movie is more describing a scenario or a case that is amenable to classical realism than it is to what we're calling neorealism. Right? And so the question here is, does anarchy create fear, or does fear create the effects of anarchy? If anarchy is creating the fear, then we have, just to go back to the previous slide, then we have, if anarchy is creating the fear, what's going on is an anxiety about the relative distribution of power in anarchy, right? And so as you're watching the movie, you've got to see what's going on with the boys psychologically there. Are they picking up on changes in the arrangements of power, the distribution of power in the anarchy that's constituted between them or amongst them? Or is there something else going on? If we remember our classical realists, just to go back again, they believe in the tragic power-hungry version of human nature. And of course, human nature being what it is, there's qualitative variables that creep in there, such as pride, irrational fear. And if you're watching this movie and you're seeing more of those sorts of psychological effects, then you will perhaps be much more inclined to take a classical realist analysis of this, okay? So obviously, watch the film, take a note of these questions, and then once you've watched the film, you'll find time to prepare your journals and focus in on this question of whether there's an irrationality to the fear that besets the boys. If you haven't seen the film before, you will soon. You'll know, but if you have seen it before, you'll know that it's basically a story about boys who find themselves stranded on an island. They're from Britain. Very, very easily, they find it possible to set up a kind of a provisional government to govern themselves. But the government falls apart, and the question is why? Why do they suddenly get thrust into anarchy? And what theory would best explain it? Neorealism or classical realism? So we will end this lecture here. This is the end of part 2, and I will see you in class. We will watch some of the movie, and then the day after we will have our in-class debate and discussion of your journals, and hopefully you will have had some time to answer the questions that are listed here on this slide. Thanks very much for your time, folks.